So now we're going to move to submerged aquatic vegetation with Dr. Charles Martin. He is a research assistant professor stationed full-time at the U.S. IFAS Nature Coast Biological Station down in Cedar Key, Florida. He received his BS in biology and PhD from the University of South Alabama and has served as a postdoctoral researcher at Louisiana State University, studying the effects of Deepwater Horizon oil spill on coastal flora and fauna. His research involves examining how biotic processes and anthropogenic activities influence the structure and function of estuarine ecosystems. And his current research experimentally assesses how these factors such as climate change, invasive species, oil spills, trophic interactions, loss of biodiversity, and hydrology affect Gulf of Mexico ecosystems.
All right, well, thank you all for the opportunity to be here. As Monica mentioned, I've been on the Gulf Coast for a long time, pretty much my whole career. I was actually on Dolphin Island finishing my PhD when Deepwater Horizon oil spill hit, and so I did a little work then, moved on over to Baton Rouge at LSU, and worked with the Coastal Waters Consortium, which was a Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative funded project, which is where most of the work that I'll present today comes from, and got a faculty position in 2016. Moved over to Cedar Key, Florida to a new marine station, but I still do a lot of work here in the Northern Gulf, which is a place that I really love. So here in the Gulf of Mexico, we're really fortunate to have some of the most productive waters in the world, and it's driven by the nation's largest watershed. And this region provides the majority of seafood for the region. As you can see on the table in the top right, estuarine landings in this area, more than double that of any other region. In addition, the Gulf of Mexico contains an abundance of wetlands that serve as a nursery habitat for many of these commercially and recreationally important fisheries, as well as providing other ecosystem services and benefits, as well as numerous desirable natural resources. All right, and these natural resources provide opportunities for revenue for anything from tourism, ecotourism, to commercial shipping, to mineral exploitation, and it's exploitation of minerals that led to the latest and perhaps one of the greatest disturbances in recent memory to these estuaries, and that's the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, which is the reason that we're here today. All right, and so this is a topic that needs little introduction to this audience. So I'll suffice to say that April 22nd, 2010, explosion and sinking of the Deepwater Horizon drilling platform released a tremendous amount of oil, some 4.9 million barrels into the surrounding waters that impacted estuaries all across the northern Gulf of Mexico, including many of these vital nursery wetlands used by fishes and macroinvertebrates. Okay, so with that in mind, I'd like to tell you about some of the work that we've been doing to assess how the oil spill affected coastal ecosystems, specifically submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV, it's sometimes referred to, things like seagrass and estuarine grasses that grow completely submerged under the water's surface. All right, and my training is largely in the area of experimental ecology. All right, so doing experiments is really useful after disturbances, because you can go in after the fact and experimentally manipulate systems and try to determine, put some cause and effect, because you can't just go back in time and do field sampling. And this is a bit of an aside, but I think one of the things that this oil spill has highlighted is the need for more baseline monitoring across the northern Gulf of Mexico and Gulf of Mexico in general, something more like the NCs and on the Pacific coast. So anyways, I'll start out by talking about how oil may have impacted submerged aquatic vegetation. In this case, we're going to be talking about Ruppia maritima, which is the most abundant submerged vegetation across the northern Gulf. We'll talk about growth, reproduction, root morphology. And I'll switch gears ever so slightly and talk about what sort of food web impacts that this oiling could have on some of the herbivores like grass shrimp and amphipods, things that are really important fish foods. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of the food web work that we've been working on. All right, so starting at the base of the food web with plants. productivity of these estuaries in the Northern Gulf is driven largely by the quantity and quality of numerous species of vegetation. All right, and as I mentioned, talking today about widgeon grass, or sometimes it's called ditch grass or Ruppia. This coastal vegetation has numerous benefits. All right, it's a refuge for juveniles of these commercially and recreationally important species. It provides a food source for a lot of different organisms, and it's called widgeon grass after the duck, widgeons. All right, they like to come in and eat it. It's a buffer from high energy events like hurricanes and storms, and it improves water quality and clarity by taking nitrogen out of the water. All right, and Ruppia is a really common species in this area of the country where you don't have a lot of thalassia and true seagrasses. You find this grass in, well, it can grow almost anywhere in ditches or shallow water environments all along the coast. Okay, so in the aftermath of the spill, a number of these coastal wetland plant species were impacted by oil, and when it comes to vegetation, to date, mostly what we know about is effects on emergent vegetation, things like spartina. We know much less about how oil affects submerged vegetation. Right? And this is important because a lot of the oil is unaccounted for. All right, it's entrained in the sediments, and so how plants can grow in these sediments is a question that's of great interest. All right, so the objectives of this talk, I'll tell you about some of the experiments that we've done to answer the questions: what are the effects of oil on Ruppia, and are there food web implications? So these are really simple experiments that are really strong and powerful in drawing some cause and effect relationships. We performed an experiment in greenhouses at Louisiana State University where we grew these plants for a couple of months, or actually 1 month period. We exposed these plants to a range of oil contaminated sediments, and these are based on field values that we took, and this color coding scheme I'll use throughout the talk. No oil, or the control, in white, low oil in green, medium concentrations of oil in yellow, and high concentrations in red. So we replicated this 12 times for treatment, and we buried the oil in this case because we didn't want any confounding factors of shading from the oil at the surface. So we entrained the oil into the sediments and planted the Ruppia to approximately that depth. All right, and then we compared several different response variables among these oiling treatments. We looked at growth, we looked at reproduction, and Ruppia in particular, reproduction is really important. There's some populations of Ruppia, especially in Texas, that die back completely in the winter and come back completely from the seed bank. Right? So we thought reproduction would be a really important thing to look at. And also we looked at root characteristics. Because we buried that oil, we thought we might see some effects on the roots themselves. All right, so I'll walk through these one at a time. For growth, we measured the proportion change from before to after experiment in terms of weight and the number of shoots per plant. And here we found, this shows the change per day for all the different treatments across the y-axis. And you can see wet weight didn't change with increasing oil. However, number of shoots did decrease, but this decrease was not significant. All right, so we didn't see significant differences for growth. For reproduction, we looked at the number of fruits and the number of flowers. And when it came to reproduction, both flowers and fruits were affected, with the lowest incidences at the highest oil concentrations, the medium in yellow and high in red. All right, so so reproduction was affected, and this is a bit of a debate in the scientific literature. Sometimes plants reproduce more under stressful conditions, right, to get some genetic recombination so maybe the next generation can survive. It's not always true, but occasionally that does happen. All right, and finally, since we buried that oil, we measured a variety of characteristics of the roots. For this particular project, I worked with a PhD student at LSU, And he was a little crazy because he had an interest in these little root hairlets, right? The tiniest little things, measuring the diameter of these roots and the length and all these crazy things that require incredible precision that I don't have. So he was a great addition, and we learned a lot about how oil affects the roots of the plants. All right? And that's shown here. And there's a lot to see here, but I'll kind of walk you through this. We found that root mass was not affected, but root length showed a strong trend of decreasing length with increasing oil. The area, however, showed the opposite trend, with increasing area at higher oil concentrations. And likewise with root diameters, thicker roots and more heavily oiled treatments. Okay, so what the sum of this means is that root morphology changed from no oil, where it grew deeper and thinner roots, to high oil, where the roots didn't grow as deep. They were shorter and fatter when most of the oil was present. Okay, and so finally, we measured one other thing, and that's uprooting strength. So we measured the amount of force it takes to pull these plants out of the sediment. All right? And we found that significantly less force is required at medium and high concentrations of oil to uproot these plants. All right, and this is really important. This is likely related to those changes in root morphology, but maybe also lubrication of the sediments themselves, and maybe changes in the microbial community that affects soil cohesion. But this shows that there's a potential for greater erosion as a result of oil-contaminated sediments. All right, and this is something that's been shown in several previous studies by Brian Silliman in a PNAS paper. He went out and put PVC at the edge of the marsh and measured erosion in oiled and reference areas, and showed that oiled areas eroded faster. Gene Turner did the same thing in islands of Barataria Bay. He used went back in time on Google Earth images and measured the area of islands that got hit by oil and islands that didn't get hit by oil. So this is something that's been shown in the field, and certainly agrees with our results. Okay, so our second objective was to determine if oil exposure led to an alteration in the transfer of energy from plants to herbivores, the first step in the food web there. One surprising trend that we found when we analyzed these plants is that increased oil exposure led to higher nitrogen content in plants. All right, so this graph shows the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So higher values indicate more carbon, lower values indicate more nitrogen in relation to carbon. And the link between plant nitrogen and herbivory has been pretty well established in studies of plants from terrestrial and marine ecosystems, and just a few of these examples are shown here. And these all indicate that herbivores want that nitrogen. They prefer plants with higher nitrogen content. So we wanted to do an experiment to see if oil had this same effect. Would oil, since it has higher nitrogen concentration, would oil exposure to plants lead to preference from herbivores? So we did another experiment. We used ground plant tissue from experiment where we grew these plants in different oil concentrations. We ground it up and embedded it in agar, and this is a technique that's been used for several seagrass studies. And we fed these shoots to one of two herbivores, either 5 grass shrimp or 10 amphipods. All right, and within this, we did 2 separate experiments. One, we did a paired choice experiment where we offered the herbivore a choice of all possible combinations. None versus low, low versus medium, medium versus all possible combinations. Then we did another experiment where we didn't give them a choice. All right, so they had to feed on the same thing. So we were looking at the rate, how fast they eat and how much they eat. All right, for the first experiment, this is for grass shrimp. Asterisk indicates statistical significance. In the cases where they had a choice, they preferred the medium or higher oiled grasses over lower oil exposure in the plants every time. So it seems to confirm that our hypothesis was correct. They do prefer oil grasses. We did the second experiment. We see something totally different. And this was, I think, super interesting. When we look at this, they consumed, when they didn't have a choice, they consumed more plant tissue from none or low exposed plant tissue than medium and high. And so we went and we dug in the literature, and turns out this is also a pretty common trend, a compensatory response. Because of that nitrogen in these plants, more nitrogen in plant tissues, they don't have to eat as much to reach those same nutritional requirements, right? So they have to eat more of the unexposed tissue to get the same amount of nutrients as they do from the medium or heavily exposed plant tissues. For amphipods, we did the same sort of experiments. Again, in this case, they preferred high, heavily exposed plant tissues. We did the second experiment. We didn't see statistical significance. Some people might try to argue that's marginally significant, but we noticed that, hey, this is like 2%. All right, and this is not much over 24 hours. So we ran the trial again for 48 hours. Sure enough, there's that same compensatory response where they eat, have to consume more of the unexposed plant tissue to reach those same nutritional requirements. So, okay, one more thing I wanted to talk about, and that's sort of putting these results into the bigger picture of the whole food web. All right, in the years since 2010, we've learned that Deepwater Horizon oil spill has had pretty variable effects on populations. For some things like insects, we know it has a negative effect. All right, for some things like marsh fishes, populations seem to be fairly stable, and some like large predatory fish seem to have some evidence that it actually increases. And this is probably due to indirect effects like closure of the fishery and those sort of things. So what we've been working on is putting together a food web model. And we do this, we've done this so far through doing literature searches. So SAV is on the bottom right. So we put these together and we can assess their position in the food web, how many links there are going to a particular node here, which is the dots, and then how sensitive it is. And so we can plot it out on this bar plot, see where things fall out, and sort of have a predictive model for how we think the food web will change with oiling. And so here's another exercise that can be done with this sort of synthesis activity. We can use these data to sort of envision how an oil spill will affect the overall food web structure. So if you took out everything that's the node in red, you'd end up with something like this, and then you can do the same sort of topology measurements and connect us looking at links and whatnot in the food web. So we put this together, and so what we've been doing since then is using biomarkers, things like stable isotopes and fatty acids to track flow of energy through the food web. And we'll compare these results, and we're putting together an ecopath model as well to so that we can do things like turn-off fishing and see what sort of reverberating effects happen throughout the food web. Okay, so some take-home messages from my talk today. We had 2 objectives. What are the effects of oil on Ruppia? We found no effect on growth, but reduced flowering, changes to root morphology that led to a decreased uprooting force. And are there food web implications? Yep, because of those changes to plant chemical composition, we found that foraging trends were altered. And so with that, there's a lot of folks to thank, including our funding and a lot of people that helped out with this throughout the years. And thank you for listening.